The letter arrived on a Tuesday, slipped between a grocery circular and a water bill, as if it had no particular business being important. But the return address stopped me cold. Whitmore and Associates, Estate Law. I stood at the mailbox in my front yard, still in my gardening gloves, the morning sun cutting across the lawn my husband had seeded by hand 31 years ago. I turned the envelope over twice before I went inside. I didn't open it right away. I set it on the kitchen table and made coffee first, the way I always do when something feels too large to hold all at once. I listened to the percolator and looked out the window at the oak tree in the backyard, the one my son climbed every summer until he was 14 and decided he was too old for trees. I thought of my husband, Thomas. I thought of how he used to say, "Dorothy, the things I can't say out loud, I put somewhere safe." I never knew exactly what he meant. I do now, because that letter told me I owned a great deal more than I realized, and my son and his wife were already sitting in a real estate attorney's office downtown 4 days earlier, signing paperwork to sell a property they believed was theirs to sell. My name was on every deed. It had been 11 months since Thomas passed, 11 months of learning how to occupy a house meant for 2 people, of cooking dinner, portions that were always too large, of waking at 3 in the morning and reaching for a warmth that wasn't there anymore. My son Daniel called on Sundays. Sometimes, when Vivian didn't have plans that stretched the afternoon into evening and left no room for a 10-minute phone call, I didn't hold it against him. I told myself I didn't. He was my only child, born during the worst ice storm of 1987, delivered by a doctor who had to park 2 blocks away and walk in. Thomas had held my hand the entire time and cried when Daniel came out, which was the only time I ever saw my husband cry. We built everything around that boy, not in the way that makes children soft, but in the way that makes parents quiet. You give and you do it gladly, and you tell yourself the love will always be enough currency. For a long time, I believed that. The trouble with Vivian wasn't that she was unkind, exactly. It was that she was precise about it. She never said anything outright terrible. She had a gift for the sentence that sounds like concern, but lands like a verdict. When I came to their home for Thanksgiving 2 years ago and wore the blue sweater Thomas had loved, Vivian touched my arm and said, "Oh, Dorothy, that color does nothing for you at your age. I'll send you something from my sister's boutique." She smiled when she said it. She always smiled. Daniel had heard it. He laughed, a short, uncomfortable sound, and changed the subject. I went home that night and put the sweater in the back of the closet. I haven't worn it since. The call came on a Wednesday morning in late September. I was pruning the rose bushes along the south side of the house, the ones I planted the year Daniel was born, one for every month of the pregnancy. Thomas always said they were the most stubborn roses he'd ever seen. "Just like their owner," he'd say, and kiss the side of my head. Daniel's name lit up my phone screen, and I pulled off one glove to answer. "Mom." His voice was warm in the way it gets when he's about to ask for something. I know that warmth. I've known it since he was 9 years old and wanted a second dessert. "We need to sit down and talk about some things. Vivian and I have been doing a lot of thinking." I said, "Of course. And when could they come by? And should I make dinner?" "Actually," he said, "we were thinking Sunday. Just coffee. We don't want to make it a big thing." I should have heard that. "We don't want to make it a big thing" almost always means the thing is very big indeed. They arrived at 11. Vivian wore a cream blazer and carried a leather portfolio, which I noticed, but didn't comment on. Daniel kissed my cheek and sat at the kitchen table where Thomas and I had eaten breakfast together for 28 years. Vivian looked around the kitchen with the expression of someone assessing square footage. I poured coffee and sat across from them. "Mom," Daniel started, folding his hands on the table, "we've been thinking about the future, your future, and ours." He paused. "This house is a lot for one person." I looked at him. "It's 4 bedrooms, Vivian said, setting down her cup without having taken a sip, "and a yard that requires significant upkeep. And the neighborhood, while lovely, is changing. Property values are at a peak right now. which means this is actually the ideal time to make a move. I said, a move to something more suitable, she said. There's a wonderful community in Clearwater, Sunridge Estates, very well reviewed, single-story units, a dining hall, activities. You'd have people your own age around, community. You wouldn't be alone here. I looked at my son. He looked at the table. And, Vivian continued, smoothing a page in her portfolio, Daniel and I have been exploring whether we might convert this property into a rental investment initially, with the possibility of eventually transitioning into our primary residence once we're ready to start a family. The school district here is exceptional. I let the silence sit for a moment. This is my home, I said. Of course it is, Daniel said quickly. And we're not asking you to just, there would be funds from the sale. You'd be comfortable. Sunridge is very, Daniel. I said his name the way I did when he was small and had gotten the answer wrong on purpose. This is my home. Thomas and I bought this house together. I raised you in this house. Vivian's expression didn't shift. Which is exactly why it might be time for a new chapter, Dorothy. Staying too long in a space full of grief can actually prevent healing. She said it gently, with the slight tilt of her head that I imagined she practiced somewhere. We're thinking of you. I thanked them for their concern. I walked them to the door 20 minutes later, having said very little else. Daniel hugged me at the threshold. A quick, careful hug. The kind that apologizes without using words. Vivian was already on her phone by the porch steps, speaking quietly to someone about square footage and comps. I closed the door and stood in my hallway for a long time. The house was very quiet. Sun fell through the transom window above the door, the same way it had for 3 decades, striping the hardwood floor in gold. Thomas had refinished those floors himself, the summer Daniel turned 4. He'd spent 3 weekends on his hands and knees, sanding and staining. And when it was done, he'd picked me up and carried me across the threshold again, laughing, and said, a house this good deserves a second first day. I put my hand flat against the wall and breathed. Then I went to the kitchen and stood at the window for a long time, looking at the oak tree. I didn't call anyone. I didn't cry. I just stood there until the quiet stopped feeling like emptiness and started feeling like mine. I didn't sleep well that night, or the next. I moved through my days as I always do: coffee, garden, a book in the afternoon, dinner that I made too much of and ate alone, but something had shifted in the way the rooms felt around me. Smaller, more provisional, as if the walls understood they might be reassigned. I called my old friend Patricia on Thursday. We'd been friends since Daniel and her daughter were in the same 2nd grade class. A friendship outlasted 2 marriages on her side and 1 relocation on mine, and more years of ordinary life than either of us bothered counting. I told her what had happened, all of it, including Vivian's portfolio and the brochure for Sunridge Estates that had been left on my kitchen counter, glossy and deliberate. Patricia said several things that I won't repeat, most of which were accurate. Then she said, Dorothy, have you actually looked at everything Thomas left? All of it? I told her I'd gone through the will with the family attorney the previous spring, right after the funeral. The house, the savings account, the modest pension, the car. I'd signed where they told me to sign and taken home a folder that I put in the filing cabinet in the office and had not opened since. There was only the one attorney? Patricia asked. I said yes, as far as I knew. Thomas was a careful man, she said. A quiet, careful man. Did he ever say anything about the Whitmore firm? Roger Whitmore? On 5th? I told her I didn't think so. She said, maybe check the filing cabinet again. All the way back. I almost didn't. It was 9 o'clock in the evening and the office was cold and the filing cabinet stuck on the 2nd drawer as it always had. But Patricia's voice stayed with me, the way she'd said a careful man, as if she knew something she wasn't certain she should say. I pulled out every folder. Insurance policies, car titles, appliance warranties, going back to 1000, 997, and at the very back, tucked behind a hanging folder, labeled Miscellaneous in Thomas's handwriting, a sealed envelope. Not sealed with glue, sealed with tape that had been layered carefully, deliberately, over the flap. My name written in Thomas's hand across the front. Dorothy, when you need it. Not if, when. I sat down in the office chair and held it for a while before I opened it. Inside was a single handwritten page and a business card for Whitmore and Associates, with a direct number written below the printed one in blue ink. Thomas's hand, again. The letter was short. That was Thomas, never 10 words when 5 would do. I've kept some things separate from the joint accounts because I wanted them to be entirely yours, not subject to anyone else's claims or pressure. I should have told you sooner. I didn't, because you always trusted me, and I didn't want you to feel like I doubted your strength. I should have known better. You are the strongest person I've ever known. Call Roger Whitmore. He's been holding everything in trust, and he knows what to do. This is not about money, though there is some of that too. It's about making sure no one can ever tell you where to live or how to exist. I'm sorry I won't be there. I loved you every single day, too. Dad, I read it 4 times. Then I sat in the cold office for a very long while, the business card between my fingers, thinking about my husband and the way he noticed things quietly and loved me without ever needing to announce it. Roger Whitmore answered his own phone. He was in his mid-60s, I guessed from his voice, unhurried and clear. When I said my name, he said, Mrs. Calloway. And there was a particular quality to the pause that followed. The kind that carries waiting in it. I was beginning to think I might call you myself. We met in his office the following morning. It was a small, wood-paneled room on the 5th floor of a building that had been on 5th Street longer than I'd been alive. He stood when I came in, offered his hand, and the first thing I noticed was that he had the organized stillness of someone who keeps his word. He walked me through everything. Thomas, it turned out, had inherited 2 properties from his own father. Years before, we married a small apartment building in the east part of the city and a commercial rental on the county line. And rather than folding them into our joint finance, where they might complicate things or invite interference, he'd maintained them separately in a trust. My name was the sole beneficiary. The trust had been accumulating quietly for decades. The properties were paid off, rented consistently, and managed by a firm Roger had overseen on Thomas's behalf. The total picture was considerably more than I had imagined. Your husband, Roger said, turning a document toward me, was very specific in his instructions. He said, and I'm reading directly here, Dorothy spends her whole life making room for other people. I want her to have something that is hers alone, and that no one can ask her to give up. I looked at the page without really seeing it. There's one more thing, Roger said, carefully. I received an inquiry last week from a real estate attorney representing your son and his wife. They seem to be under the impression that certain properties associated with the Calloway name may be part of a jointly held estate. He paused. They are not. Every deed lists you as the sole owner. Your son has no legal standing in regard to any of this, including your primary residence, which was signed over to you individually as part of Thomas's estate planning in 2019. I looked up. He did it quietly, Roger said. He told me he didn't want a fuss. He just wanted to make sure. I thought about Thomas refinishing those floors, about him planting the rose bushes with me in October, wearing the old coat with the fraying cuffs, saying nothing, just digging. I thought about every Sunday morning for 28 years. What do I do now? I asked. Roger folded his hands on the desk. Whatever you'd like, Mrs. Calloway. That is rather the point. I did not call Daniel that afternoon. I had thought about it on the drive home, rehearsed the conversation in my head while I was still in the elevator, but by the time I got back to my house and unlocked the front door and stood in that hallway with the sun coming through the transom window, I realized I didn't have anything to say that needed to be said urgently. Some truths don't require rushing. Instead, I called Patricia. I told her what I'd found, all of it, and she listened without interrupting, which Patricia almost never does. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Thomas Calloway, that quiet, careful man." I said, "Yes. So what now?" I looked around my kitchen, the refinished floors, the rose bushes visible through the window, the table where I'd drunk coffee with my husband every morning for nearly 3 decades and where, 4 days ago, my son had laid down a brochure for a retirement community and his wife had talked about school districts. "Now," I said, "I water my own garden." Daniel called on a Friday. I was in the backyard when my phone rang, deadheading the roses in the late morning cool, and I saw his name on the screen and let it ring twice before I answered. Not out of malice. I just wanted to finish the stem I was holding. "Mom," he said. His voice was different this time. The Sunday warmth was gone. "I got a call from someone at the Whitmore firm." "Did you?" I said. A long pause. "Why didn't you tell me about any of this?" I straightened up, looked at the oak tree. "You didn't ask, Daniel." I heard him exhale. We had no idea that Dad had." He stopped, started again. "Vivian talked to their attorney, and apparently there's nothing we can do about the properties. They're entirely in your name." "That's correct, Mom." His voice dropped. "I don't want this to be a whole thing. It doesn't have to be." "Good. Because I think there may have been some miscommunication about what Vivian and I were suggesting. We weren't trying to push you out. We were trying to help me," I said. Not unkindly, not harshly either, just plainly. "Yes," he said. "Help you. I know," I said. "Or you believed you were." I pulled the last deadhead from the stem and let it fall. "But Daniel, I need you to understand something. I have lived in this house for 31 years. I have kept every corner of it. I have stayed in every hard season in it. Your father and I built something real here. And I don't need to be moved to a smaller place to manage my grief. I'm managing it just fine." Silence. "I'm not angry at you," I said, and I meant it. "But I'm not going anywhere. This is my home, and from what I understand, it will continue to be." He didn't say anything for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. "I didn't know Dad had done all that." "For you?" "He was a quiet, careful man," I said. "You know that." Another silence. Longer. "Can I come by?" he finally asked. "Without Vivian. Just to talk." I thought about it. "Sunday," I said. "I'll make coffee." He came at 10. He sat at the kitchen table the same way he had as a boy when he'd done something wrong and knew he had to own it, shoulders low, hands wrapped around his mug. I sat across from him and didn't make it easy or hard. I just let the morning be what it was, he apologized. Not with the clean, efficient apology adults give to get past discomfort, but the slow, painful kind that means something is actually being looked at. He talked about Vivian and how her ideas had a way of becoming his ideas before he noticed the exchange happening. He talked about how he'd told himself the Sunridge plan was about taking care of me and how sitting here now, in this kitchen, he could hear how that had sounded. He said, "I think I forgot you were a whole person and not just my mother." I looked at him across the table, this man who had been inside a storm at birth and had grown up between these walls and had climbed that oak tree and scraped his knees on that driveway and eaten 1,000 breakfasts in this chair. "My son, I know you love me," I said. "And I know life with Vivian has a particular current and it's easy to go where it pulls you. But Daniel, you cannot let anyone talk you into diminishing the people who loved you first." I paused. "I'm not going anywhere, and I'd like us to be close. But closeness doesn't work when one person keeps making themselves smaller." He nodded. His eyes were wet in a way he was trying not to show. "Your father would have said the same thing," I said, "but nicer." He laughed, short and watery, and I handed him a napkin. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected. Vivian called once, a brief, careful conversation in which she said she hoped there were no hard feelings and that she and Daniel valued our relationship deeply. I said I appreciated that. I didn't say anything else. There are things that need time to become true before they can be spoken. And that conversation wasn't there yet. Roger Whitmore walked me through my options for the properties. I decided to keep managing them as they were for the time being. I had no interest in sudden transformation, only in understanding what I had and making thoughtful choices. I started meeting with Roger monthly. I found I enjoyed it not for the business of it, though that interested me more than I'd expected, but because it was an hour each month when I sat at a table and was consulted and listened to, and my thoughts had weight in the room. I rediscovered things I'd set aside. I drove to the library on Thursday mornings, the real library with the high ceilings and the smell of old paper, and read there for 2 hours without agenda. I signed up for a watercolor class, badly, enthusiastically, covering a canvas in murky greens and presenting it to Patricia with enormous pride. She hung it in her kitchen, which is the kindest thing anyone has ever done for my artistic ambitions. I wore the blue sweater, not to make a point, just because it was cold one November morning and it was the warmest thing in my closet, and because Thomas had loved me in it and I had put it away for reasons that were never mine to begin with. The idea started with a phone call from a woman named Helen, who had gotten my number through Roger's office. She was 71, recently widowed, and her son and daughter-in-law had just informed her that they were selling the home she'd lived in for 33 years, a home her late husband had owned outright, but which had passed to the son through an oversight in the estate, a signature she'd never understood she was waiving. She asked me if I knew anyone who could help her. I sat with that for a few days. Then I called Roger. What I had in mind was modest to start. A small fund to cover legal consultation fees for older women who were facing similar situations but couldn't afford an attorney to look at what they actually owned. Roger said it was a sensible idea, doable with the capital I had available, and that he knew several pro bono attorneys who'd been looking for exactly this kind of structure. I named it after something Thomas had put in his letter. Dorothy, this is not about money, though there is some of that too. It's about making sure no one can tell you where to live or how to exist. I called it the Exist Fund. Patricia cried when I told her. I told her to stop because she was going to make me cry too, and I'd only just gotten my mascara on. Helen received 3 hours of legal consultation, discovered her situation was more complicated than she'd been told, and retained an attorney who found 2 documents her son's estate lawyer had not disclosed. She is still in her home. I think about Thomas differently now than I did in the first year of grieving him. In those early months, the loss was all I could find of him. Every room held an absence. Every morning was a reminder. But now there is something else layered underneath the missing, a kind of understanding that keeps arriving slowly, the way a letter travels a long distance before it reaches you. He knew me. Not the version of me that deferred and accommodated and made herself neat for other people's comfort. The version that pruned roses at 6 a.m. and had opinions and wanted to be taken seriously. He built something around that woman quietly, without telling me, because he trusted she would find it when she needed it. He was right. I'm just sorry I needed it to be here before I could see what he'd done. I've come to believe that being overlooked is something women of my generation learned to accept as the price of love. We cooked the dinners and raised the children and held our families together through every difficulty, and somewhere in all of that, we let people stop asking us what we thought or where we wanted to go. Not because anyone forced us, exactly, but because it was easier, because the asking felt like taking, and we'd been taught to give. I don't want to teach that anymore. When younger women ask me, and some do, now, mostly through the Exist Fund, what the secret is, I never say, find the right inheritance, or wait for your turn. I say, know what you own, and I don't just mean property. I mean your history, your effort, your opinions, your decades of ordinary expertise. Nobody gets to tell you those things have an expiration date. Nobody gets to send you to a smaller room because your table takes up too much space. I am 63 years old, and I am still learning which parts of myself I packed away for other people's convenience. Each time I find another one, I put it back on. The house is very much mine. The floors Thomas refinished shine in the late afternoon light, and I walk across them every day, without particular ceremony, and every day it means something anyway. Daniel comes for Sunday coffee now, most weeks, and we talk not carefully, but honestly, which is harder and better. Vivian is polite, and I am polite, and somewhere in the distance between those two politenesses, there might eventually be something real. I'm not in a hurry. The roses along the south wall came back this spring fuller than they've been in years. I don't know if that means anything. It might just mean they had a good winter. But I stood in the yard last Saturday morning in the early light, coffee in hand, looking at them. And I thought about the woman who planted them 31 years ago, who believed that some things grow better when you stop apologizing for how much space they need. She was right. She was right the whole time. She just needed a few seasons to remember it. This is not the end of anything. I have a foundation to build and roses to tend and floors that still shine and a blue sweater that fits just as well as it always did. I have a son who is slowly learning to see me and a best friend who hung my terrible painting in her kitchen and a lawyer who calls me by my first name now and means it as respect. I have this house, which was never anyone else's to give or take. I have this morning, and the one after it, and the one after that. That is enough. That is more than enough. That is, at last, entirely mine.